Welcome to the Retail Code. I'm Lisa Amlani, and today we have Gary Newbury and Ricardo Belmar. Gary, introduce yourself, and then we could pass it on to Ricardo.
I'm a senior exec on call specializing in rapid change management within retail supply chains and the last mile. And my purpose in life is to inspire retail business leaders to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win one epic supply chain at a time. So Ricardo.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Lisa. So I'm Ricardo Belmar, and I have a long history in retail as the retail tech guy, in the sense that I've always been with various different retail tech providers and service providers, really helping retailers get the best results from all their technology investments, especially when we're really trying to focus on the outcome that the technology enables versus the technology itself. As I always like to say, that's the key factor in retail tech.
Then we are definitely talking to the right person.
Yeah.
And just a little bit about me, I am a merchandising expert. I've been in retail for 20 plus years, and my claim to fame is really around speed to market, getting customers closer to their retailers and vice versa. And of course, digitizing things like the line plan and product creation, and of course, parts of merchandising. Ricardo, thanks for being with us today.
So it's such a pleasure to have Ricardo on the conversation today. What we want to start with is just throwing a question out there. We're interested in understanding why retailers may not adopt technology. And we'll probably get onto some of the issues around that later, but why there's a reticence about adopting technology, even though there may be maybe even a clear competitive advantage. Certainly, some of the technology gives us meaningful insights so we can actually understand our customers much better. Or there might be just like with robotic process automation, just a clear ROI or self-checkout tills.
Right.
Where we're looking at taking out labor, and there might be a very clear ROI. So we're just trying to understand initially, what's the reticence here?
You know, it's an interesting topic because so many retailers like to dive into a new technology because, as you just said, Gary, right, there's this thought going in that there's a clear outcome, a clear result that they're going to get, whether it's, it could be a labor reduction, it could be some other operational cost savings. And there's a trend right there in that, right, there's this expectation that whatever new technology you bring in has to have a cost reduction component associated with it. And what happens in many cases, and this isn't true with all retail tech, but in some cases of retail tech, you're just offsetting one cost with another. So it's not necessarily going to be a net operational cost reduction. It may be an offset where you're basically shifting a spend area from one spot to another, but you're gaining other advantages. So it might be an in-store experience advantage. It may be an associate productivity advantage. There may be other things where rather than trying to cut costs through a new technology, you're using it in a way that's going to, for example, augment top line revenue, and that's where your win will be. So I think one of the issues in adopting new technologies is really understanding what is that outcome that you should be expecting. And to be fair, right, this is where I'll kind of point out some self-damaging things here in the retail tech side of the ecosystem, right? The tech providers, the service providers, we often don't do ourselves any justice here because we tend to overhype and overpromote some of those cost reduction aspects, because we've all learned over the years that what gets a retailer's attention up front, cost savings. So we try to emphasize the cost savings, and it's not that we're making it up. It's that it sometimes isn't going to be there at first. Sometimes those cost savings come over time. But the other advantages that you have at the beginning, those are the ones that retailers should target. So I do think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding that happens with a lot of retail tech deployments, and that sets the bar at the wrong place for how you measure that outcome. And that also, to me, relates a little bit with corporate culture at a lot of retailers. So if you think about silos, and we've all worked with retailers that are so entrenched in their silos that right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing from one department to another, right? And that causes a lot of problems too with deployments, and particularly when it comes to that final execution, especially in store, and when you're trying to do it at scale. One of my favorite conversations with retailers and in-store deployments is Retailers like to talk about a proof of concept test, right? They like to talk about, well, let's get a quick proof of concept up and running. Let's prove it out in one of our test stores. And 9 times out of 10, I end up looking at that retailer and saying, well, I'm going to predict right now before we even start that the proof of concept will be a success. And I'm not saying that because I'm the person bringing the technology to you. I'm saying it to you because I suspect if you look historically, 9 out of 10 proof of concepts you do in that test store always succeed. And it has more to do with the store and the people that are there and how successful they are at implementing something new versus your ability to scale that from 1 store to 10 stores to 100 to 500. And it's when you go through that scaling, that's where new challenges come in that nobody ever predicts. Right? No one predicts what those new scaling technologies are, often because as cookie cutter as a retailer may think, they're putting technology across 500 stores. Chances are, they may not have 500 different versions of that implementation, but they probably have 150 different versions because store formats are not identical across the board, and you just don't know. So that introduces another challenge. And then a third one that I find is really relevant here, again, especially when it's an in-store technology, is the lack of pursuing buy-in from those frontline workers in the store. Anything you put in the store, you have to assume is going to be used in some way or interacted with in some way by those store associates, whether it's customer-facing technology or not. You're relying on those frontline workers to either operate it or at least be aware of it in some way and leverage it in some interaction with the customer. And trying to put something in like that where you don't get their buy-in usually doesn't work. I'll give you a great example from a customer I worked with a few years back in the UK. They were deploying a clienteling app that they had built themselves, deployed on tablets. And the origination of this app is they realized from their customer satisfaction surveys that there was a lot of buyer's remorse. This was an electronics vendor. And they had a lot of buyer's remorse, seeing people who were doubting that they had made the right purchase 3 to 5 days after they left the store. So they wanted to reduce that in the hopes that by eliminating that buyer's remorse, they'd get more repeat visits from those customers for other products. So the thought was, let's give our associates an app that has a guided experience they can use with a customer that helps ask all the right questions up front to avoid that buyer's remorse. Now, of course, the original version of this app and the plan to deployment, at no point did they ever talk to any of the frontline workers about how do they interact with the customer? How are they doing this today? What kind of questions were they asking? So you can probably guess what happened when they first put this out in the first 10 stores. Majority of the store associates responded by saying, it's too slow. It doesn't help me. It just gets in the way. I don't even want to use it. It slows down my process with the customer, and I get less commission that way as a salesperson, so I don't want this. And for a long time, that retailer was scratching their heads, why are people not wanting to use this? Why do they think it's so slow? And that's where that scaling element I mentioned earlier came in. When I went to work with it, we figured out that part of the problem, it had nothing to do with the app or the tablet, but it was other infrastructure in the store that was getting in the way of the performance of that app. And once we addressed that part of it, suddenly then when we showed it to the associates and said, here's what you can do with this app, here's how it's going to help you get a customer transaction done better and faster so you can work with more customers, which, by the way, means you're going to get more sales commission out of it. And then suddenly we had buy-in. Associates liked the app. Once the performance bottleneck was removed, they started adopting it and using it. Both of those were things that could have been figured out up front earlier on with the right approach to that rollout.
I just want to step back into the second of those points where you talked initially about the scaling, and before we move into the do's and don'ts. One of the things in Canada that it may be quite noticeable versus, say, the US or certainly in the UK is the use of franchise networks. We seem to be obsessed with dealer networks, franchise networks, where you have a corporate brand, a head office, and oftentimes that may be transmogrified into some format locally. What triggered me into this comment is that when you mentioned 500, I immediately thought of Canadian Tire and 500 dealer network, and how each one of those in the early start of the pandemic all had a different aspect of how do we do click and collect and how do we deliver this brand experience to our consumers nationally when we get working through a dealer network. And we mustn't underestimate some of those challenges, not only with the technology, but within our business structure as well. So Lisa, I'm sure You want to, you're
Yeah.
chomping at the bit on the question. And let's go.
Just talking about silos always gets me thinking that your Canadian Tire example is an example of silos. Well, let me ask, would you say that changing of mindsets is as detrimental to technology being implemented as much as those silos? And how do you think that we can change that? How do you think we can shift those mindsets ahead of the implementation?
There's definitely an aspect of that. On the one hand, you've got the silos, which at the end of the day, what do the silos do? It kind of prevents the flow of information and knowledge between different groups. So, well, at least on paper, it's, you would think that's a little bit easier to overcome if you get the right invested parties, right, in a given deployment. But to your other point on the overall mentality, which I always view as part of the corporate culture, a lot of that I find has to do with buy-in from the top executives. So if we're talking about a major technology initiative, it's not enough to say executive buy-in is someone saying, here's some budget, go do it, right? Too often, that's the buy-in that you get. And unfortunately, that's just not enough, because that doesn't really encourage anyone who's going to be involved further down the process to really understand and believe that there's a legitimate reason why the company and the organization wants to do this, and that there's an overall benefit for everyone. That executive buy-in has to be there throughout the whole process. And it really does require what I would argue is true leadership, in that if that technology is expected to do something meaningful and have a really strong ROI, then the executives that are driving that need to drive the definition of that ROI. They need to drive the distribution of that ROI information throughout all of the different groups that are going to be involved in this project, so that everybody has an equal understanding of what the goal is and why the benefit is going to be applicable to them. Because I think that's one of the key things that gets missed in a lot of retail organizations, and getting that buy-in, right, is that people are told we need to do this, but they don't have a clear view, or they're not given a clear definition of why it matters. And ultimately, I think to just give a reason that says, well, the executives at the top say we're going to increase revenue if we do this. That's great, because if I'm one of the employees in that organization, I'd like to think that none of our executives are going to ask us to do things that are going to reduce revenue. So if you just tell me it's going to increase revenue, that's probably not enough detail. And I probably want to know more about why we think it's going to increase revenue, because I might realize from that definition that, hey, there's a contribution I can make here that means I'm going to have a part in increasing that revenue. And that just makes the entire organization stronger.
Yeah. And I think that there's also another question around the last 15 months where technology and digital transformation has been accelerated in retail. A lot of folks that I've been in contact with, when we hear the word digital transformation, we understand it's the simplification of the way we work, modernizing the way we work, reducing manual processes, etc. How do you answer the question when somebody comes to you? Is this going to mean that my job is redundant because technology is going to come in and, save the day and change the way we do things?
It's a tough one, right? It comes up quite a bit, I think, especially in the case of technologies in the store and how that impacts store associates and staff, because there's always a thought that, well, is some form of automation trying to replace my job here? And I guess the tough answer is that it depends, right? It depends on what the technology is and how it's going to be used. I tend to take the view that these latest technologies, especially things that have come up in more prominence in the last 15, 18 months since the pandemic, a lot of these technologies are in some ways meant to make an environment safer. They're meant to make an environment less tedious. And that's one that I like to focus on, because many times the digital transformation that we're trying to implement is really meant to streamline a really difficult, challenging, error-prone process into something that's going to be much more reliable and sustainable and repeatable without requiring a lot of tedious human intervention. And I think there's a difference there in saying, in comparing any human intervention in a process versus really tedious intervention. There are a lot of tasks, and we all have them, right, regardless of what job we're in, that we know it's repetitive. And we know that at the end of the day, if we repeat it 100 times, odds are 2 or 3 of those times we're going to make a mistake. We're all human, right? We're all people, that it's natural. But if you can make it an automated process and remove that tedious part of the process from my task list, now I'm free to do other things, right? Which means maybe I allocate more time to other tasks in that process, where before I might have said to myself, I wish I could spend more time on this versus the tedious part of it, but that's so time consuming I can't. now I'm free to do that. For me, what I like to focus on is anytime we have these digital transformation projects, we really want to outline up front, what are the individual people benefits that are going to allow you to do things that you might not have been able to do before. And those things, by the way, might have nothing to do with the process that digital transformation is being applied to. It may be a completely ancillary activity, but now it can be made more important and more useful because I can shift the amount of time I spend on it as a human being. And that can be an advantage. And that can also help people buy into a project like that because you eliminate the fear of losing a job. I think this really comes up more often when we start talking about AI and machine learning applications, right, and technologies and where they're going to be applied. So I've had discussions with folks where they're looking at adding new AI-based systems for forecasting, for things like replenishment analysis, where there's a lot of people crunching away on spreadsheets normally, and now you're coming in saying, well, you can put away those spreadsheets. You won't need them because you're going to feed this data now into this AI-based system, and it's going to give you really meaningful insights. So that's not to say your job isn't necessary anymore, right? You're going to shift from analyzing the numbers on a spreadsheet to derive the insight. Now you're going to shift your time to saying, how do I act on that insight instead of spending 80% of my time coming up with that insight? So I think those are the important shifts that always have to be talked about with any new technology. Yeah. Is how is that affecting people? How are they going to shift their workload in a positive way? Sometimes on the surface, everyone, and again, I'll say, this is sometimes it's all the vendors out there do this. We focus on the positive being you're eliminating all this tedious time. But that's only one part of it, right? The real answer you want to promote to people internally is now that we've eliminated that tedious time, here are the wonderful new things you're going to put more emphasis on, which, by the way, you were probably already doing, but you wanted to spend more time on it and couldn't. And that's what's going to make the organization better and the business better.
Yeah.
Recognizing that retailers tend to work in silos. I don't know of one that doesn't, unless they're very small. And the other one is onboarding guys who are going to do this once the technology is installed. How are they going to be effective? And some of the questions might include, as an individual, what's the training plan to allow me to do those extra tasks, or more of those tasks that I used to just have a dip at? Now am I going to be trained to be able to not only take this information, but to really do something with it and run it forward? So of those organizations to perhaps are successful at implementing all the way through and getting it fully adopted and embedded into steady state, and those ones which kind of faff about, for want of a better word, and the project doesn't deliver the desired outcome, are there some key factors which would make you say, they did this to be successful, they didn't do that, or they did this to be very unsuccessful, or at adopting and say, realizing the benefits of the technology? What are your thoughts about some of the key factors that a successful implementation and one that's less than successful?
There are a couple of things I find with most retailers that have a successful technology-based project. One is the breadth of which different groups get involved in the project. And when I say get involved, it doesn't necessarily mean that they had to cross over 50 different departments and cross all those siloed boundaries and get an army of people involved and they all had to be constantly participating in this. That's not what that means, right? What that means is you have all the necessary people involved at the points where they need to be involved. So for example, if I use that same retailer I mentioned that was doing the clienteling application in the UK, part of their problem at the beginning is you had one business group driving this activity and out of the marketing team driving the development of the app. They picked the tablet technology, but they didn't bring in, for example, anyone from the IT department until the very end, when they started to put the technology in those 10 test stores and they selected the stores. Had they brought those folks in earlier, they probably would have had a discussion that talked about, well, wait a minute, when this app is running, is our network infrastructure in the store such that there's enough bandwidth for this new application that's going to be driving a lot of rich media on screen to show customers with product details and things of that sort? Maybe that's an issue. We don't know. Let's take a look at that. The marketing folks assume, well, that's obviously going to work, so let's not even talk about it until you got to the end. And of course, that's where the problem was at the end of the day that they ran into. So getting the right people involved early in the process, not because you need them involved at every step, but because you really want to have a checklist that says what's every potential area that could be touched, even if it's indirectly related to this particular deployment, and who from that area that owns that related function can tell us whether it's okay to check this box as everything's good, or whether we need to dig into this box and say, well, maybe there's an issue there we need to look at up front before we get too far down the path. Now, and those are the discussions that can happen along the way that are going to have a huge impact when it's time to scale from those 5 test stores to 500 stores. Other areas, I think we touched on a little bit before, it's making sure that people using whatever the technology is going to be had some input. Now, you can also take this a little bit further and say, if it's a customer-facing technology, have you ever had any discussions, or maybe you interviewed some customers and asked them, would you use this? Before you just decided that this is something, if you put in the stores, customers would use. Or if it's something you're optimizing on your website, have you done some tests? Have you tried it out? Have you come up with a customer set where maybe you set up some test pages and you directed 10% of the visitors to the site that day to go to that page and see how they responded versus the rest, and do a comparison? It's things like that you want to do along the way to make sure that the outcome you expect is both realistic and achievable, and that you're on the right path to get it. So I think those are maybe some of the little things that I see happen quite a bit in that. And then maybe the third piece is that, although I see this fortunately now happening less, because I think that if there's one benefit of technology related out of the pandemic, is that the way retailers have focused on it has improved, in the sense that before we still had a lot of retailers kind of getting distracted by the shiny new technology and saying, oh, that looks really interesting over there. Maybe that's something that will benefit us. I don't know how yet, but let's take a look at it and see. Where now there's been more of a realization that I need technology to help accomplish specific things. Let's seek out the technologies that can impact those specific things and work backwards into it that way. And at the same time, not get distracted because, oh, there's a shiny new technology over there. It's okay to wait for that one. We know we need to work on this immediately. And then maybe one last piece, I guess I would suggest here that I see more successful retailers looking at is not getting lost in the desire to get to 100% completion. And what I mean by that is 90% of getting that technology deployed in a certain way might be enough to get the desired outcome, particularly if your outcome maybe is increase in sales in stores, or if we're talking about an online site. That might be enough. It may not be perfect, and it still leaves the door open that you may have some negative results along the way. But here's the thing with that: what those negative results tell you what to focus on as you iterate on improvements. And that's one thing where I do think the best retailers that came out of the worst parts of the pandemic learned is you have to be willing to iterate on these technologies. There's really no such thing as a one and done technology, I think, in retail tech. Just because you say, I've deployed it, doesn't mean that you can walk away from it now and it's always going to be perfect. You need to keep in mind that you're always going to want to make improvements to it. But because you're always making improvements, you don't have to get to that 100%. It's okay to release something, depending on the technology, get 70, 80, 90%, but then keep iterating. And the other advantage I think that gives a lot of retailers is you can put things out there much faster, so that what used to be 6 months in a deployment project, you can do it now in 6 weeks. And I've personally had more than a couple of retailers tell me that their CEOs are now going to their CIO saying, well, now that you did this in 6 weeks, I know that never to believe you when you tell me it takes 6 months to do something. So I'm just always going to expect every new project to be no more than 6 weeks. And they're now starting to really gear their teams around this concept that every project is iterative. We're going to define up front what can we get done by 6 weeks, and whatever's left to do after that, that just rolls into another 6-week cycle. And we're always iterating on these things and always churning them through, making improvements, knowing that it doesn't have to be perfect day one.
I'd be interested in your impression about, is that the digital transformation? Has it happened by having curbside? Or is that just a small sliver of what's ahead for most retailers, but they may not actually know that this is just one small step towards a huge seismic change in how their business model might change, and how their processes and technology, their culture, their people, their structures, how that's all got to change. I'd be interested in your, is curbside it? Are we done?
I think the best way I can answer that is to look at how Target has leveraged curbside pickup. I think they are one of my favorite examples of this because, for one, they were already on that path before the pandemic. So that was one advantage in their case, is that they had the foresight to say, this is a good idea, before the pandemic came around, but they really doubled down on it during the pandemic and expanded it pretty quickly. But they did it in a way that really worked. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head now, but when they report in their financials, right, the numbers of usage patterns and adoption, I mean, they're just astronomical rates of change, right? So from one quarter to the next, it's 175% more transactions. But what I think is really interesting, and getting to your point, Gary, it's not just curbside pickup, right? So what did that really mean for them? What it meant for Target was fulfillment out of stores. And so they didn't just look at this as, how do I let a customer pick something up without coming into the store, which is, you could have looked at it that way. They looked at it as, how am I going to use this to move store inventory at a faster turn rate so that I can actually deliver product not just faster to customers, which gives me an advantage over, say, competitors like Amazon, for example, but also, it just makes my operations more efficient. And now I can't remember what the number, but it's something on the order of 95% of their digital transactions are being fulfilled from stores, yes. Which I think is just unbelievable that they've been able to extract that much efficiency and operational control out of it. But that to me is the digital transformation there, right? It's not that they did curbside pickup, even though I think we can safely argue that implementation of curbside is what drove this transformation of store fulfillment for Target, which they're continuing to expand and continuing to grow.
I'd love to deep dive more into other types of implementations that you've worked on that not only impact the sales store staff and the frontline staff, but also the internal teams. We've heard a lot of horror stories. I've been in them with SAP implementations back in my days, but that would be super interesting to talk about in terms of how did you get buy-in from those other teams that are not used to giving buy-in at all?
Yeah, maybe one example I can think of, one of the service providers I was with for some time delivered a lot of network connectivity services to stores and data security services, as well as online training applications for staff. And the reason I mentioned that combination is because it turns out that those three things actually touch a lot of different areas in the retail. So if you think about the connectivity, well, okay, that's a clearly IT related thing. Every retail expects their IT shop to manage store communications and connectivity, make sure everything is up and running all the time. But then there's the data security part of that, which tends to pretty much touch everybody at the end of the day. I remember a few customers who we did some upgrades to that store connectivity in parallel to them doing it. And it's interesting, you mentioned SAP, so I'll stick with that one because I remember one customer that was in the middle of an SAP rollout that was quite challenging for them, but it also required a lot of data being ingested from the stores while we were in the midst of this communications upgrade. It was really intended to double their capacity so they could move data faster. And it turns out with that customer, one of the big complaints a lot of their users had is that all the SAP data wouldn't update fast enough. They'd try to run a report or they'd try to do a query and pull something up, and it would take so long, and it would end up resulting in them getting either bad data because it wasn't properly collated when we were talking about a 1,000-store retailer in this example. And so you had that challenge with the data freshness, let's say, but you also had to layer on security, which unfortunately at the time we were doing this is some years ago, adding all these layers of security tended to imply that the data was going to move a little slower through all those communication paths, which again just exacerbated those SAP performance challenges they had. So that meant that we had people completely outside of the IT department, right? You had people relying on the SAP data. They could have been merchandising folks. They could have been people trying to run a forecast, and they couldn't because they didn't have the latest sales updates. So they didn't know how to handle replenishment counts. So all these things were being coordinated, and they were all being driven by essentially one small group in the IT department that was responsible for the data connectivity. And they, in turn, were not used to dealing with users from all these other departments that they don't normally touch. This was another one of those examples where it's an organization where we as the vendor were trying to break through all the silos and get all the different people in each department to talk to each other so they could A, understand each other's problems, and then B, so we could help them realize why those problems were all related to the same issue. They were all related to the same project, even if they didn't know it was at the time, and they were being treated as independent projects, but they actually impacted each other. And once they realized that, they were finally able to better coordinate, which in turn meant that we, as the vendor that were supplying a lot of these services, we knew when to turn things on in a way that operationally wasn't going to impact the SAP updates that they were doing and the users who were on that platform who were relying on this underlying infrastructure that we were providing, but they didn't even realize that that was something provided by an outside vendor. So all those little interactions kind of had to be coordinated, and in and of itself, there was no one responsible for that coordination internally because they were all siloed parts of the organization.
Is this kind of, I'm going to throw something out there, and that is when you're a small retail or small business and you're looking to put something sophisticated in technology, an ERP system or something of that nature, WMS, whatever, you can put it in because you can almost put your arms around it. And as soon as you start to go to 100, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 stores, you absolutely need tech because it's the only way you can capture everything, process that information, and use it. And that's exactly the opposite in terms of organizational structure that facilitates smooth adoption of technology.
That's very true. It's one of those times when I like to point out that there is an advantage oftentimes, right, to being a smaller retailer, and it's because you don't have a lot of the legacy tech debt that a lot of larger organizations have. You don't have as many silos in the organization, and your analogy, I think, is the right one. You can actually put your arms around it and actually see it all when you're that small organization, which in many ways makes it easier for you to deploy these advanced technologies.
Imagine you get access to some cutting edge technology, which really does give you a competitive advantage. The only thing that you've got, to put in a way is maybe the budget, maybe the will to do it, stroke culture, versus a big organization where they may have a big budget and may have a predisposition to get more control, more planning going on in this very complex multi-site environment. And going, how do we do this around here? Who do we get involved to some of the points you mentioned? How do we scale this and get consistency so we can actually see what is going on and then inform ourselves as to what to do?
In fact, one of the things that I bring up a lot with retailers around that is this need for collaboration, whether it's internal or external. So historically, one thing of retail, right, is an industry that because it's competitive in its nature, there's not a lot of collaboration from one organization to another. I tend to believe that's changing in the sense that we see more and more neutral organizations, let's call them, or associations that have risen that are trying to foster that collaboration. I think a lot of that has been driven by smaller retailers, primarily because, as you pointed out, right, they lack the resources. Even though they could get their arms around it, they may not have either the deep pockets or the resources to implement something, but they need some help, or there's a piece that they don't know. Nobody on staff understands that piece. Where do I go to get those learnings? And you rely on some of these third-party organizations. And now I think even larger retailers are benefiting from that, whether it's industry associations, whether it's, there's been a rise of academic organizations coming up that are creating a center of excellence or innovation centers that can help bring the community together, right? Whether it's retail tech startups, small retailers, large retailers, but there's in a neutral space where it's okay to talk to the other guy in a sense, right? Even if they might be a competitor in a category, it's okay to talk to them about the technology. And what I like to tell retailers in this regard is that part of the reason why it's okay is, look, let's face facts. If you're thinking about this new technology and how it's going to benefit you as a retailer, pretty good chances all of your competitors are having the same thought right now. And they're all asking themselves exactly the same question: how is this technology going to help me? So where it used to be that if you were the first one to implement one of those technologies, that was automatically your differentiator and your advantage, I would argue that today that's not necessarily the case, right? The differentiator comes in the final execution step and how you implemented it. The fact that you implemented it, the fact that you chose that technology, that's not going to be all that differentiator from everyone else, because all the technology providers are chasing all of the retailers with the same message, the same technology. So everyone eventually is going to adopt these things. It's just a matter of how are you going to use it differently. But until you get to that step, there's no harm in collaborating with other retailers and asking each other, how are you looking at AI? Where are you leveraging machine learning? How are you using technology to augment your frontline staff in some way? Right? It's okay to have those conversations now and copy the learnings from an operational and process point of view. And frankly, even just knowing who to talk to, right? Which vendors should I put on my short list? Who's been successful deploying what? It's okay to ask these questions and to find them out now, because it's not going to hurt your competitiveness.
I completely agree. And I think that's happening in sustainability as well. Levi's is a great example of that, sharing their learnings and their knowledge on how to save water when manufacturing. So I think that it is happening, and I love to hear that it's happening on the technology side too.
Awesome. We're moving into, I would say, a more mature set of conversations than we ever had them before. I think if nothing else, if a pandemic has facilitated that must be a really good thing, because we as a whole retail ecosystem, we need to do a much better job, because CPGs are going to go direct. We need to find new ways of doing things, organizing ourselves, collaborating to make sure that we're the preferred channel of choice for people who make these products. We need to have them going through our networks, not through drop ships and other arrangements. On that bombshell, I think it's a wrap.
Thanks, Ricardo, for joining us today.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hit the like button and leave your comments. Connect with us on LinkedIn to get the heads up on future episodes of The Retail Code.